The outline that was given to me, I'm sorry I'll have to speak in English, so please forgive me. There's a constraint on this part. It is on. I'll bring it closer. Is that better? The title of, or the area where I was asked to speak on was the role and responsibilities of professionals in human settlements. In yesterday's sessions, I think a lot of cues and a lot of opinions were expressed which identified what the roles and responsibilities are. The way my paper is structured is that I'm going to be talking about how the Habitat Conference, which I happened to attend, what are the areas of concern that were outlined there. Then I'm going to talk about the role of professionals in the context of Pakistan itself, focusing in, and then focusing furthermore on my own experiences as an academician, teaching as an architect, and the role that architects and educationists can play in the improvement of the built environment or the habitat. The Summit of Summits, Habitat 2, that took place in June 1996, provided professionals an agenda to be followed to look into the issues of adequate shelter for all and sustainable development. The reason why I believe it sets the agenda is that the participation in the summit involved all key players and stakeholders, along with government representation, parliamentarians, local bodies, scholars, researchers, and NGOs. These are all professionals or people who deal with the built environment. Although the people themselves were not represented, the poor, their representation probably came through the NGOs or the activists that were there representing them, the areas that they were working in. This paper deals with the roles and responsibilities of professionals in human settlements related to the issues raised in the conference by the participants. The paper will focus more specifically on the role of professionals in the context of Pakistan. Being trained as an architect by profession, I cannot help having a bias towards the role of architects in the built environment. Since I happen to be an educationist, and I'm a very firm believer that it is the training programs of professional schools that provide the basis for professional practice. The built environment delves into issues beyond brick and mortar, and apart from the whole range of other professionals that are required for an integrated approach towards sustainable development of the habitat, one must not forget the key, which is the people that we are all working for. The primary concerns that were voiced in the conference in the numerous forums and meetings, they were outlined to some extent yesterday, but I will, in point form, just give you, raise the issues, the concerns again. The first issue was housing as a right. The primary concern was that the majority of the population in developing countries, more so, are expected to be poor. So those are the people that we're going to be dealing with as a majority. There is an overconsumption of resources by the urban systems. Stress of overconsumption threatens peace and sustainability. The diversity of cities and their problems demand locally specific responses. We can only deal in generalities up to an extent. Cultural independence is to be recognized as a basis for new and sustainable development. The recognition of traditional values and systems in human settlements development and security are a precondition for sustainable development, which was very well highlighted yesterday by Arif Hassan. Equal access for men and women to land and property rights. Impact of transport and communication technology on the development of human settlements. There were a number of occasions where the concern, which was also elaborated in our discussions yesterday, on the fact that a lot of the presentations concentrated on the city and did not recognize or adequately address the concerns of the vast majority of the rural population. But I think there was some clarification on it. When you're talking of the habitat, you're also addressing the rural areas to an extent. With these list of concerns that I've just outlined, there were a series of recommendations and actions that followed at a global policy level, which defined the whole range of professionals that have to be involved in this process. The diversity of professionals, actors, and stakeholders can be seen through this list of concerns itself. It involves not just professionals, it is also people working in development authorities, in municipalities. There is a whole range of people in education, people in health, and so on. So there is a whole range of professionals that are involved in this process. By and large, all the forums that took place at the Habitat Conference, the forums were of professionals, parliamentarians, mayors, local bodies, and so on. The underlying recommendations were dealt with empowerment of communities, capacity building of institutions, and awareness generation. These were the three key issues that emerged when one looked at the recommendations of all the different forums that took place, which were headed by different professional bodies or institutions. Coming down to the issue in our country, in Pakistan. Yesterday, I think Arif Hassan and Fauzia Qureshi presented the current situation. It's rather bleak. There is no doubts on that score. I won't go into to the details, but generally one can talk about, if you just look at the housing situation, there are approximately 250,000 housing units that are required in the city in Pakistan today. There is a current backlog of almost 1.5 million housing units in the country. Added to this, there are something like 300,000 housing units that are needed in the rural areas. So the statistics just to do with housing alone are bleak, and we can get into all the other gamut of land and infrastructure and so on. And the statistics speak for themselves. What is the professional's role in this bleak situation? I believe that the professionals who are currently involved in providing service to the people in Pakistan are perpetuating the formal sector, which is far removed from reality and the needs of the people. I think this was again highlighted yesterday in Arif Hassan's paper. We find there is no meeting ground between professionals and people, and there is an inability on their part to deliver services to the poor. People by and large are fending for themselves. House building is on a self-help basis. There are no professionals involved when it comes to house building. There are no architects involved. There are no engineers involved. There is an inbuilt credit system. There are no formal sector financing agencies. There are no formal professionals providing people with credit, with a system of credit. People have developed that at their own level. An incremental system of development has emerged from people themselves. Professionals have not played a role in this development process. There is probably a fear on part of professionals to get involved in an activity like this because of their lack of understanding of these mechanisms. The people continue to work for themselves, they're managing for themselves. And the professionals, I believe, do not understand the mechanisms that are being followed currently, and therefore they are not in any position, and there is an inability on their part to provide a service to this sector of the population. One of the reasons for this inability is primarily based on the training of professionals. Our professionals are trained on Western models. Case in point is architectural training. our training is based on RIBA's curriculum. RIBA is the Royal Institute of British Architecture, and it is the curriculum that was devised by the Royal British is being adopted in our local schools of architecture. There are 4 schools of architecture in the country today. The professionals who do graduate from in different fields find that it is far more lucrative for them to work in the private sector, corporate sector, because it is a formal sector. And therefore, they find that their expertise is geared towards at that level, and therefore there is a hesitancy or a inability on their part to service the informal sector. I will just briefly go through some of the recommendations that I have outlined. A lot of this is also spoken of yesterday. Under the circumstances that have been outlined earlier on, what is the role of the professional that should be there, and where are the areas that we need to concentrate on to improve or to create a role for the professional in the development of the majority of the population. The partners referred to in the Habitat Conference, such as local authorities, mayors, municipalities, local bodies, and professionals and researchers, they need reorientation programs to deal with issues of the built habitat when it comes to the poor. Because of the kind of training they've had, there is a complete de-education program or a reorientation program that is needed for professionals if they need to function. There have to be changes in the institutional frameworks and managements of most of the agencies that deal with the habitat, such as municipalities, development authorities, and so on, where transparency and independence is given to agencies. Just to elaborate briefly, yesterday I think there was some talk on it as to how our local development authorities, the framework under which they have functioned, and how political appointees are undertaken there, that if they develop the whole framework whereby which appointments take place in development authorities has some kind of a syndicate which or a board of governors which involves not just professionals and the bureaucracy, but maybe even extending right down to concerned citizens and people with whom they're going to be dealing with, the local population, representation from the local population. Training and management courses for professionals working in these agencies. Agencies such as NEPA and other training academies need to run specific programs on human settlements and urbanism. Now, currently, these are the agencies that provide training at management, administrative level to a whole range of people working in these agencies. The way the curriculum or the thrust of those training programs, leaving that aside, because that itself needs to be revised or revamped, but at NEPA, for instance, there is no program that is run specifically on human settlements or urbanization. Only recently, this was about 3 months ago, that they ran a short course on urbanization. I mean, you have things on rural development and you have areas of other courses which are run, but human settlements and urbanization have no courses. There are no such courses which are run there. Added to this is the changing the nature of the training and curriculum at the schools of architecture as well as other professional institutions by expanding their programs into real life situations. I will later on quote the kind of work that I'm involved with, where case studies are actually taken into the field and you learn. There's a hands-on experience of learning, which becomes part of the training process of professionals. Professionals' roles have to be expanded and strengthened. As mentioned yesterday, it is professional bodies' roles. Professional bodies, NGOs, have always played a very crucial role, like mentioned yesterday, in the changing of laws or acting as pressure groups. Professionals will have to act as watchdogs through pressure groups to ensure that actions are taken in the interest of the city and people. Again, a point which was very vehemently raised yesterday, that linkages between interprofessional bodies and NGOs dealing with habitat have to be developed. Awareness is to be generated not only at professional levels, but also at grassroots levels. An example that I'd like to quote here is the fact yesterday when the session started, and Afia mentioned that how many people were actually aware of the Habitat Conference, and it was also stated that it was only a few months ago that the fact that the Habitat Conference was taking place, the awareness was not there, the information was not there. And therefore, the result of all this was that it was, when we were there were participants from local bodies, there were mayors present there were academicians present there were and there were different forums. And it was a sad story on part of the Pakistan's representation there, that there was not a single representative, for instance, from any of the development authorities, the bodies that are governing the way your urbanization development is taking place. There was nobody from LDA, KDA, Faisalabad, I mean, you name it, and there was no, except for two official government representatives from the ministry. The others were from NGOs and so on. So that in itself is a reflection of the interest and the awareness. There were a lot of preparatory meetings that did take place, and I can provide you with a list of them. And however, the awareness within our country, the dissemination of that knowledge, either through the government or through the UN, was not there here. I believe that there is a vast human resource available at the schools, at professional schools, and they should be utilized to document, research, and disseminate this information. I think students, again, I can refer back to the schools of architecture, for instance. We have a whole pool of a human resource pool there, and it is the students themselves which can be used through the schools, through NGOs, through other agencies which are involved in the development of the habitat, to use the student manpower. Right? Okay. Because the next part of my paper it really deals specifically with the role of the architect in the human settlement process. I've just given you a broad outline of what my thinking process is, but I would now like to come down to specifically the area of my concern, where I feel more confident about speaking. The current role of the architect in the development and creation of the built environment in our country is negligible, at times even detrimental to the growth of an appropriate architecture. Architects must play a role in the national development. However, if the profession has to have an impact on development, it must cater to the needs of the lower income masses. The role of the architect today is to make the formal sector appropriate and the informal sector viable. It is imperative, therefore, that architects be able to tap in on the vast potential available within the informal sector. The current situation is that the formal sector trained architects number about 1,500 and about 300 odd planners who are registered as practitioners in Pakistan. They provide service to even less than 1% of the urban population in the country. The services of an architect are sought by the urban population comprising the rich and corporate sector. The fact that this situation has been consistently deteriorating since the last 50 years as urbanization processes accelerated, the impact of the trained architect has not been felt or developed commensurate with the developmental demands of society. He is looked upon merely as a creator or a facelifter for a clientele that can afford him. The profession is dependent on a patron that will provide capital for the implementation of his design. This is not to say that there is no opportunities available. There is opportunity available for architects to provide services to the vast majority of the urban poor. However, very limited number of architects are catering to this population, the underlying reasons being twofold: the training of the architects themselves, the training programs, and the perception of the public of the kind of services that an architect can render. The trained architect, as I mentioned earlier, is a product of a Western-oriented curriculum. We have imported a ready-made system of architectural education which stresses on development under a different set of social and technological conditions. This has created a gulf between indigenous technology and materials which do not come close to the real needs of the majority of the population. Architects are inadvertently trained on the assumption that the project will be financed by someone. This is in keeping with the traditional role of the architect, that he will have a patron. However, with depleting resources and low cash flows for cash-intensive projects that construction purposes demand, even some excellently designed architectural projects are made unfeasible because of lack of know-how of how to even finance these the projects. So even within the corporate formal sector, the training of an architect falls short because of his lack of know-how at innovative financial packaging of projects. Training of architects has to incorporate generation and means of funding, which include not just large-scale projects, but also small, low-income housing projects, for instance. We're talking about development of credit systems and so on. To understand this, or to be able to implement something like this, we have to understand the dynamics of the situation. And for this, we have to turn to people themselves and understand the system under which people operate, because the systems are functioning at that level. Low-income housing, for instance, demands incremental development and on very stringent budgets. Professional architects have to understand these basic requirements and the priorities of the poor. They have to look at housing as a process and not as an end product, which is how architects by and large are trained. In practice, to provide services to the low-income sector, the architect's role is that of a facilitator or an enabler. The training of architects has to be undertaken with a process-oriented approach rather than an end product approach. Issues such as slum upgrading, low-cost housing utilizing community participation demands a very different approach in teaching, whereby the design studio should be shifted to the area under study to understand the dynamics of the community and find solutions with the community and not for the community alone. The role of the architect, therefore, has to be recognized initially at an academic level in terms of inducting finance management and packaging of projects as part of the curriculum. Added to this is that opportunities have to be created to practice works related to low-income housing. NGOs are only a few agencies which are involved in such work. Examples of organizations undertaking such projects, the Orangi Pilot Project in Karachi, the Arhan Rural Support Program in the northern regions, are some of the examples to be quoted. The government, if at all, has undertaken such projects. There are lots of projects that can be quoted that have been undertaken through technical assistance programs and World Bank funded programs and so on. They are undertaken as studies, as feasibilities, which are announced internationally. There are international consultants that step in. They take on the lead role with our local professionals joining hands with them. These works are then run under very stringent bureaucratic setups, which are very formal sector oriented. And by and large, most of these projects are then relegated to pilot studies and subsequently official files. Because in terms of implementation, really very limited is seen. And this is visible in most of the projects that you can see, even projects such as the 3 Marla scheme, the schools, second primary school project, the health projects, and so on. As a final point, there has to be greater thrust put on understanding our traditional building heritage and construction technology. This is to prepare the architect to be more sensitive to the cultural climate, to to culture, climate, and more appropriate technologically developed architecture. Designs incorporating traditional building practices and details will also provide an awareness and respect amongst our masses for their own heritage and overcome the current trends of adulation for everything Western. As part of this, I'd like to just mention to you the case study that I've used some of my students of the fourth year architecture program, which we've done very often. As a matter of fact, Fauzia and me have very often taken up projects with students, and we've been dealing with it we take the students out into the field and take on a live project as such, where the students are really going through a learning process on the site, talking to people, doing socioeconomic surveys, understanding what the real issues are, and then coming up with solutions which are part of a process rather than an end product, because you cannot just design and construct a house for the poor or design and build the infrastructure and say this is it. It is an incremental process and it has to go on. Currently, I'm involved in this project in northwest Lahore. The whole issue, my interest started in that area when I noticed that a lot of the sewage from this area, this is primarily low middle income area, was being drained directly into the canal which runs through the city of Lahore. And it is a very major asset of the city of Lahore. And therefore, the sewage water was really polluting the canal waters. Whilst looking into the area, it just so happened that there was an opening ceremony of one of the bridges that were crossing the canal, and to enable the VIPs that were coming to do the inauguration, the outlets of the sewage which were flowing into the canal were blocked off, so that the canal would look nice and clean. The result of the blocking of that sewage into the canal was that something like a population of 50,000 households was affected, and there was a backup of sewage in the settlement, with almost knee-deep sewage standing in the streets, inside the houses of the people. That was the time this was the time when I had taken my students there to sort of look into an alternative solution for the disposal of the sewage water in the canal, and we discovered that the alternative system had already been proposed by the powers that be or by the authorities, and they had just blocked it. And it was from there that we started looking into the area and really looking at because the people right now do realize that what are the kind of repercussions that can happen, because this was the sewage water was being thrown into the canal at a illegal level, although it had a quasi-legal sort of cover from Vasa. But this fear is now always there that if we continue, so there is an alternative system that has to be developed there, and that is an area that we're looking into along with the students of architecture. And this becomes a real life project for the students, and hopefully it should be then taken on as a project by NGOs through linkages with other NGOs and so on. On the other hand, there is this other study that we've just also conducted. Both these studies, by the way, were taken to Turkey as part of an exhibition of the Institute of Architects and the National College of Arts. Was the study of the Mall Road. The Mall Road is a very historical urban precinct, and there has been development has brought about a certain deterioration of the historical buildings that are there. And the students were made to do a documentation, and we were looking only at the facade treatment of the buildings, just to look at the facades of these historical buildings and what could be done. And the students were made to do a documentation of the buildings, the existing, and what the buildings actually could look like. And we are hoping to extend this project further by holding this exhibition on the Mall Road itself, talking to traders and the shopkeepers and the